Okay, so my name is Talia Eisenberg, and I'm a co-founder at Beyond. Welcome, everybody. So what is Beyond? Beyond is a program for pre-treatment, treatment, and post-integration processes involving medical facilitation and therapy. We focus on the use of Ibogaine for accelerated detoxification and radical processing of core traumas at the root of the addiction to opiates, alcohol, prescription medications, opiate replacement medications, and other self-destructive behaviors. Today's topic is based around harm reduction and whether we should consider a harm reduction based approach. So millions of people in the US suffer from addictions, and overdose rates have doubled in the last few years alone. According to the National Survey on Drug Use and Health administered yearly to Americans, only 10% of Americans go for treatment for chemical dependency. Why not the rest? Why not the rest of the 90%? This study showed that 40% are just not ready to stop using, 20% fear what others might think if they come out as having a problem, so there's a lot of stigma there, and 15% can't find a program that offers the type of treatment they want. So this leads me to believe that we may need a different approach to meet these people's needs and meet them where they are. There's another study that shows an increase in naloxone availability by 30% of what is available now will save another 300,000 lives over the next decade, yet it's not available to most. What can we do as a society to accept a more compassionate-based harm reduction approach? What does it mean to offer this if you are a therapist or a professional in this space, or even a family member or person who is experiencing chemical dependency? So today we have with us Dr. Andrew Tatarsky. He has a very long bio and I'll read it. Dr. Andrew Tatarsky is an internationally recognized leader in the treatment of problematic substance use and other potentially risky behaviors. He has specialized in the field of substance use treatment for 35 years, working as a counselor, psychologist, program director, trainer, advocate, and author. He has devoted his career to developing a comprehensive psychobiosocial understanding of the broad spectrum of substance use problems and a harm reduction psychotherapy approach to treating this spectrum. This treatment is described in his book, Harm Reduction Psychotherapy, a New Treatment for Drug and Alcohol Problems, and several professional papers that extend this approach. Dr. Tatarsky is the founder and director of the Center for Optimal Living in New York City. It's a treatment and professional training center based on harm reduction therapy for the spectrum of substance misuse and other high-risk behaviors. He earned his doctorate in clinical psychology from the City University of New York and is a graduate of New York University's postdoctoral program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. He is a member of the medical and clinical advisory panels to the Office of Alcoholism and Substance Abuse Services of New York State. Dr. Tatarsky is a founding member and twice past president of the Division on Addiction of New York State Psychological Association. We also have the amazing Juliana Mulligan with us, who's been a very active member of the Ibogaine community for 9 years, and she's currently working on her MSW at NYU. She is the psychedelic program coordinator at the Center for Optimal Living and currently runs Inner Vision Ibogaine, which supports people in preparation for Ibogaine treatments. Dr. Tatarsky is going to start with a presentation, followed by Juliana sharing her knowledge. At the end of the hour, we will have a Q&A. Any questions during the conversation can be put in the chat box, and all will be answered either live or at the end of the hour. Thank you so much for being here.
So Talia, thank you so much for that introduction. Folks, I did not ask Talia to read my long bio. What that means is that I've actually been just doing work in the field for a long time and trying to keep it interesting. Thank you so much, Talia and Tom and Beyond, for holding this very, very important webinar series on Ibogaine and psychedelic assisted therapy and related subjects like harm reduction, which, as you just heard, I've really devoted my career to drawing out the therapeutic implications of harm reduction. So I began in the field many years ago and was drawn to working with people that struggle with drugs. And I actually began working in traditional abstinence-based disease model treatment. And I think we helped some folks over the course of those early years in my career. But what I began to see over time was that the majority of people were not getting helped by our treatment programs. And just kind of looking around, the statistics that Talia was talking about were very, very much present back then. I began to see that the entire field was actually not helping the overwhelming majority of people that struggle with drugs and other problematic substances. And so I began to wonder what's wrong with this picture. And what jumped out at me was the disease concept, the traditional disease concept put forward by Jelinek in the middle part of the 20th century. And more recently, the brain disease model, I thought, which gave rise to a one-size-fits-all abstinence-only approach to treatment, which basically is irrelevant to most people, not effective for most people that engage in it, and actually harmful to many people. And I began to become increasingly concerned about that, started to experiment with breaking all the rules in a little private practice that I was starting, working with active drug users who were struggling with drugs, did not want to stop, but wanted help or wanted to make positive change in their lives. And lo and behold, many of these folks did incredibly well, which, you know, the old model says you can't benefit from treatment or therapy if you're actively struggling with drugs. And I had the good fortune to know a guy who we think of as the godfather of harm reduction therapy, Dr. Alan Marlatt. I called Alan up and I said, what's going on? The dominant approach isn't helping most people, breaking the rules is. He said, you're doing harm reduction. So for me, that was a paradigm shifting moment. And I have really devoted my life to sort of drawing out the therapeutic treatment implications of a harm reduction model. And that's what you're going to hear about. But the harm reduction model really, as Talia suggested, rides on a paradigm shift in how we understand what we call addiction. You know, our thinking at the center, and I think this is really in line with a whole paradigm shift that's happening in the field, is that we're moving toward what we call a psychobiosocial multiple meanings approach to addiction as a process that's a meaningful response to suffering, right? That reflects this complex interplay between psychology, biology, and our relationships and social context. And that paradigm shift really supports harm reduction as a framework that should really inform the entire continuum of care. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those two pieces, but then really the topic of today is, you know, what do psychedelics and Ibogaine, psychedelic assisted therapy and Ibogaine kind of have to tell us, teach us, share with us that really supports this new way of thinking. And I think that they're very, very much consistent. Over the course of my career as a person attempting to figure out how to be more helpful to more people, I've come to recognize that psychedelic assisted therapy and Ibogaine in a very special way have a tremendously important role to play in supporting people in struggling with addiction or problematic substance use. So that's sort of a general background, but I also want to share a little bit of the particular history that I have with Ibogaine. When I joined the harm reduction movement or community back in 1994. Shortly after that, I had the good fortune to meet Howard Lotsof. Howard was the pioneer. He was the man who was dependent on heroin, heard about this new thing to get high on, Iboga, and woke up the next morning craving free. And he really was the Johnny Appleseed who pounded the pavement to kind of bring Ibogaine to the world, an amazingly important historical figure. Through Howard, I met lots and lots of people who had had Ibogaine experiences that transformed their lives for the better. So I am sold, given just the number of people I've met and the miracles that I've seen. And so I'm very proud to be a strong supporter of this medicine and hope we can get it to folks that need it as soon as possible. So let me jump into my presentation. I'm going to cover a lot of ground quickly, but so this is really our topic today. How do Ibogaine and psychedelic assisted therapies support a change in our thinking about addiction? And here's really my proposal, that we need to shift our thinking about addiction to seeing it as this psychobiosocial meaningful process. And this shift is going to support a shift from abstinence only to a harm reduction framework for helping. And that psychedelic assisted therapy and Ibogaine in its own special way really support this change and are consistent with it. Talia mentioned a few of these statistics. I think it really is important, to consider that the need for a paradigm shift and the need for new approaches that are helpful is because of the devastating failure of these traditional models and treatment approaches to be helpful. Last year alone, in 2021, we lost 108,000 people to lethal overdose or drug poisoning, and 100,000 people to alcohol-related deaths. Since 2001, we've lost 1 million people, and that graph has been sloping up more and more every year. This is really a devastating catastrophe. As she said, we have 20 million folks in this country with substance use disorders. Only 10% of them go to treatment, and only 42% complete treatment. Why? Why such terrible numbers? I would suggest that the treatments out there are just not relevant to the needs of most people that struggle. Oh, and also there are estimates that about 100 million Americans are struggling with problematic substance use that doesn't meet substance use disorder criteria, but has tremendous public health outcomes. The disease model that Jelinek put forward is unscientific. NIDA's brain disease model is not supported by evidence, and neuroscientists like Carl Hart and Mark Lewis call it junk science. They know a lot more about this than I do. I'm a psychologist. The abstinence-only approach is irrelevant because, and here's really the most important practical clinical rationale for why we need a harm reduction approach. Most people who are concerned about their substance use at the point that they become concerned don't want to stop using despite the risks and negative consequences. That's a reality that we as a field cannot address unless we embrace a harm reduction framework, and I will break that down. So if it's not a disease, if addiction is not a disease, what is it? Well, let's consider the idea that it's a meaningful relationship to drugs or other activities, right? Or it's a dilemma, right? That a part of us wants to do it for very complex reasons, while another part of us may be increasingly concerned or suffering as a result of that. So what do we gain if we begin thinking about meaning? Well, consider you take a drug or you put a big bet down on a roulette wheel, and there's a huge biological effect. But that biological effect gets wrapped in meaning, right? We're not amoebas, we are meaning-making creatures. And substance use then over time comes to take on and express multiple meanings, often simultaneously. Some are in our awareness and some are not. So we might consider that that problematic behavior may be like a language that people are speaking through. What are we trying to communicate, either to ourselves or others, through our use of substances, or what gets communicated? People use for really complex reasons, right? Most folks use for pleasure, fun, recreation, liberation. But some of us find that those positive benefits actually help us with our suffering. Self-medication of anxiety, of depression, of loneliness, of pandemic panic. We've seen a big rise in substance use during the pandemic. Trauma is certainly a major factor for many, if not most people, that really struggle with problematic substance use. One of the fallouts of trauma is self-regulation difficulties sitting with really uncomfortable feelings. Shame and guilt often follow from trauma, but then shame and guilt often are the result of internalized stigma from being a person who uses drugs. So shame and guilt can be a very complex factor that can drive suffering and continued substance use. We might also think about a relationship to a substance as having relational or interpersonal meaning. You know, if in my family I couldn't express anger or vulnerability, so I had to stuff those feelings. In my later relationships, I can't express those feelings, so maybe I turn to a substance to care for myself, right? So there's both personal meaning and interpersonal meaning in that relationship to the drug. Also, when I am traumatized, I may split off, disown, dissociate parts of myself, my rage, my vulnerability, my sexuality, my sadness. And often those parts that may be out of awareness may actually find expression in the use of that substance, or I might be comforting myself, those parts of me with that substance, right? And also substances can help us with a sense of group bonding, membership, connection when we have difficulty connecting. And there are many, many more reasons, but this is just a smattering of what may be going on in that complex relationship. So to the extent this is going on, we could think about an addictive relationship as one that expresses and disguises parts of us, right? Now, to the extent that that's true, problematic use, urges to use, risky behavior, we might think of as like entry points for an exploration, a rediscovery, and maybe a reintegration of those parts. Interesting way to think about recovery is kind of recovering parts of ourselves that we've lost a conscious connection to. What part of you wants to do this? You know, if the urge could speak, what might it say? So on top of the meaning, if I'm turning to a substance and it's really helping, over time it may become an overlearned habit. Through neuroplasticity, it might get wired into the brain. The social context can contribute to suffering and also additional motivations for using. And of course, there are biological factors. You know, genetics may increase vulnerability to use a substance and find it helpful in some way. Neuron receptors, you know, get upregulated and downregulated with chronic use. There might be neurochemical depletions. We might develop tolerance as a result of this. So you need more. You're not getting the same effect. You might, with some drugs, experience really painful, in some cases, life-threatening withdrawal, you know. So consider the costs and benefits of a disease model that just focuses in on the biological piece and kind of ignores all of those other complex factors, and how that can really collapse meaning and prevent us from actually being able to do the work of recovering those, you know, and reconnecting to those parts of ourselves. This is a very crude schematic, but basically think about all these things in the upper left circle as vulnerabilities that, you know, can have us vulnerable to turning to a substance and finding it helpful. Some combination of those factors really that's unique to each person, right? So we need to be thinking about unique relationships between sets of vulnerabilities and the substance. Over time with chronic use, we have these biological and other kinds of factors setting in, which may increase suffering and increase the desire to use. But what we gain from this, I think, is an understanding of why people may continue to use, because they actually find the substance helpful in relation to those vulnerabilities, even while there may be an accumulation of negative consequences and risks and suffering, so that people may be caught in this dilemma. You know, this is continuing to help and it's increasingly hurting me, but, you know, I don't want to give it up because it's sort of helping me manage, you know, or reconnect with vital parts of myself. And that really is another kind of theoretical rationale for why we need a harm reduction approach that can invite people in while they're continuing to use to do this important work of unwrapping, unpacking what's being expressed through the substance, so that we can liberate that part and help people begin to reintegrate. And what does harm reduction do? This is the basic frame that, we want to support any reduction in harm or any positive change without requiring abstinence. We don't need to have you commit to a goal in order to support you in beginning a process of positive change. That really can be a tremendous barrier. And we don't want to impose our values and agendas on you, because we want to create a space to support you in discovering what's true for you, what goals and what approach to change makes sense for you. Then we can really meet people where they are, around whatever their goals are, whatever motivates them. That becomes the glue for our alliances, our relationships. We can lower the threshold. You can get involved in positive change wherever you're ready to begin your process, right? And of course, non-judgment, empathy, acceptance really are the cornerstones of this approach. And also gradual incremental change in the substance or in those complex factors that may need to be addressed before we can realistically talk about addressing the substance. And empowerment, collaboration, really inviting people to be actively involved, so that in effect, we're here to support people on their journey and their process, rather than disempower them by requiring them to submit to our agendas. It's really a way of turning that one-size-fits-all authoritarian prescriptive approach completely upside down. We want to empower and support and help kind of collaboratively figure out what's going to work for each person. So an integrative harm reduction approach is going to integrate clarifying personal and relational meanings, providing active strategies to promote positive behavior change, right? And also mindfulness is a really powerful skill or capacity. Being present with acceptance in this moment is going to support both the clarification of meaning and positive behavior change. And this all happens in that harm reduction frame. So this is the model, which we don't have time to really go into, but really it starts with establishing alliance, establishing relationships, right? And how do we most effectively do that is kind of the challenge that I think harm reduction really facilitates. So Ibogaine, let's shift to these wonderful medicines that are bringing us here together today. Joseph Barsulia, who spoke at the last webinar in this series, brilliantly about the brain mechanisms that are affected by chronic drug use and how Ibogaine kind of addresses them, calls Ibogaine miracle grow for the brain. It rebalances receptors. It works on all of the transmitters, neurotransmitters that are affected by various drugs. It augments GDNF, which increases neuroplasticity, learning, neuron growth. And that gives us a kind of a window where we're more open to new learning. Restores connections in the brain, enhances blood flow. It's just an amazing psychedelic that has all of these capacities that I think many other psychedelics don't have. And one of the really amazing things that Ibogaine does is it can, for many people, interrupt opiate craving and dependence. People may come through a session of 18 hours, 24 hours, 36 hours, craving free, feeling like they're the way that they felt before they ever became dependent on substances. And there's studies from lots of different places that Ibogaine works not just for opioids, but with alcohol, stimulants, nicotine, and so on. Works on lots of different brain systems. So I'll say a few words about sort of the topic today. I think all psychedelic assisted therapies and Ibogaine facilitate healing addiction in ways that support the change in thinking, the paradigm shift that I was just talking about. First of all, the psychological, relational, and spiritual aspects of these therapies are really critical to the healing process. So we've just heard about Ibogaine's amazing ability to affect brain systems, the biology, but many people, if not most people, really say that these psychological, relational, and spiritual elements are really the cornerstone of change, that the medications actually help enhance. There's a growing consensus that the medicines are not the cure, but that they are catalysts or adjuncts to psychotherapeutic processes. This is a study by Schlossauer and company from 2020. In the last webinar, Bruno, the other presenter, also talked about how, the action is in the psychotherapy. These medications actually enhance, facilitate, the psychotherapeutic action. Therapeutic preparation and integration are keys to success, we know, in this community. So what we're talking about is substances that really enhance therapeutic processes. Psychotherapy is the main ingredient. Ibogaine prepares people for the therapy, is what another researcher, Bruno Rasmussen, said last month. So how do they do this? Increased openness, I think, is really a key. And I think that increased openness amplifies the therapeutic alliance and relationship before and during the medicine sessions, so that if there's a good relationship, it actually intensifies the goodness, the safety, right? That enhances safety, which then in turn kind of supports people in relaxing and becoming more curious and self-reflective about themselves. It relaxes this repressive barrier, helping people to make contact with deeper parts of themselves, repressed memories, dissociated trauma, right? There's a somatic, energetic, and emotional release. So because of this openness, people can kind of let go of a lot of stuff that has been kind of keeping them tight. It deepens connections to the self, others, and the world. Johann Hari famously said, the opposite of addiction is connection. And these substances, medicines, have this incredible ability to help people feel more open and connected. They also help us see that reality is constructed by beliefs, and beliefs that we typically picked up in childhood. And so seeing that, it makes it more possible to think about changing those beliefs and changing our experience of ourselves in the world. Typically, these old patterned ways of thinking are disrupted by these medicines. And people often have the experience of reprocessing trauma, reworking sort of traumatic experiences and the beliefs that kind of flowed from them. And then, of course, many people experience existential spiritual awakenings, sense of unity, oneness, connection to all and everything, which can be profoundly healing of a sense of isolation and inspiring hope in the future. So just got a couple more slides, but now let's shift and think about how those factors that I was just talking about may actually help impact addiction. Many people begin to make connections and have much greater insight into the meaning of addictions. I talked before about multiple meanings. People may understand, be able to recognize those meanings and begin to rework them. That is, think about how to express or care for those parts of the self in new, more effective ways. The experience of being more fully connected to oneself, and this is something that I was really wrestling with, kind of how to talk about succinctly. I think it's so important. If the substance helps us feel more connected to ourselves, more open, more vulnerable, in relation to the guide or the therapist during the medicine session, it's going to enable this very powerful reworking of negative feelings about the self and relationships and others. We call this in psychotherapy speak a corrective emotional experience, right? So I think what we're aiming for in therapy in general gets powerfully enhanced in a psychedelic session or an Ibogaine session. And this, of course, can lead to a heightened experience of feeling the compassion and acceptance of therapists, which can heal toxic shame and guilt that are often driving addiction, and rework these toxic core beliefs. And I think all of this kind of supports us in feeling like we have more freedom to make new choices, new behavioral choices, think about better ways to care for ourselves. So my takeaways, let's kind of embrace the new understanding of addiction as meaningful. And that this really requires that we embrace an integrative harm reduction approach. That is, that one that supports people in beginning their process wherever they're ready to begin it on their own terms, and creating a safe space to help people kind of explore and discover their own truths, which I think this approach very much can frame how we do preparation, medicine sessions, and integration. And finally, that Ibogaine and psychedelic assisted therapy support all of these ideas. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Juliana, who has some very, very wonderful and special things to share as a jumping off point from what I was talking about.
Thank you, Andrew. That was such a wonderful way to set up what I want to talk about. And as Talia said in the beginning, I have the privilege of working at the Center for Optimal Living as a psychedelic program coordinator, but also as a social work intern. And really what the center is doing is the treatment that I wish that I would have found when I was struggling with opioids. It's really like a dream treatment structure. And so I feel very privileged to be able to work there with Andrew and all the other clinicians. So thank you. So I gave Talia a really brief bio about who I am, but something else that's important to note is I'm a formerly opioid dependent person, and I struggled for 7 years through the mainstream treatment system before finding Ibogaine in 2011, which allowed me to leave opioids behind. But what we were talking about, what Andrew was just talking about in terms of the disease model, I really want to emphasize how harmful this model can be for people. Through my own experience going through mainstream treatment, through rehab, being on Suboxone, being on methadone, going through court mandated rehabs, which were often based on disease model and 12-step program, it was always emphasized that what I was going through was my own responsibility, that it was because of me. There was never any talk of the society that we live in. And after I did Ibogaine and started working on some elements about myself and really studying these issues, I realized that many of the issues that people who struggle with substances deal with are because of the society that we live in and the way that it's structured. We live in a society that tells us that we have to suck it up and keep going no matter what. We live in a society that tells children from a young age that their value is based on the grades they get in school. And there's very little room for diversity and exploration of the unique people that we are. And so I really came to learn through my work in the Ibogaine community and with other people struggling with drugs that a lot of the basis for our current mental health issues, including substance use issues, is that we tell people from a young age that what they think and feel is wrong. And this really gets internalized and turns into self-esteem issues. It turns into depression and anxiety. And it's something that gets reinforced in our mental health system, and especially in the addiction treatment system, which tells you that your intuition is wrong, that you don't know any better, and that you have to submit to another program or to whatever your therapist or sponsor, if you're doing 12 steps, tells you to, and this is the only way because you don't know any better. I also want to say that 12 steps does work for many people, and that's wonderful, but it definitely doesn't work for everybody. And to be told that this is the only way to get better, and if the 12 steps doesn't work for you, there's something wrong with you, is incredibly re-traumatizing. And really reinforces the original wound that most of us have, is being told that what we think and feel is wrong. And so you go to treatment and you get told once again that what you think and feel is wrong, and you don't know any better, and that you're powerless. And so when I started learning what harm reduction was, I was just so excited, but also so angry that I never knew there was something else beyond the abstinence only model, and that many people have no idea this exists. I started to learn more about it, and I started realizing that this is really a societal issue that we are imposing onto people. That, you know, substance use has been a part of societies for thousands and thousands of years. But why is it such a special problem right now? And that's a really complex question to answer, and I've actually written many papers on it. But it's, you know, originally drug policies were made, they're based on racism in the early 1900s against Chinese immigrants and against Black people and against people from Mexico. That was the origination of drug policy. After that, when psychedelics were criminalized in the late 1960s, it was to control the anti-war left-wingers, which my dad was actually one of the first people arrested on an LSD charge and put into prison. So there was that whole wave of things. And so really the drug policies that we have now were motivated by oppressive systems. And it's what makes drug use so unsafe these days. So many of the problems associated with drug use, like homelessness, people overdosing and dying alone, are because we have made drug use incredibly unsafe by making it illegal and by making it very stigmatized and by putting a lot of shame around it. And so really the harm reduction approach is the best way to deconstruct these really violent approaches that we've taken towards drug users, and to embrace people's diversity and uniqueness, and really support people in getting in touch with their power, because each of us are so incredibly powerful and insightful. Rather than saying you're powerless and you don't have any intuition, harm reduction is about saying, no, you do have that, and we're here to help you see what that is, rather than pushing an agenda. So another thing I want to touch on is, why are people who struggle with substances considered a separate group from everybody else, even separate from people with other mental health issues? This, to me, is an incredibly harmful notion. And in my opinion, every single person in this world at a certain point in their life has the destructive behavior that they use as a coping mechanism. Some of them just happen to be more socially accepted by society. Like, for example, workaholism, incredibly embraced by capitalism. Shopping addiction, accepted in society. Even certain levels of alcoholism are embraced within our society. But if you're talking about heroin or crystal meth, suddenly this becomes a different thing, and you have a disease and you're very sick. And so I think that this is something that needs to be deconstructed as well. I personally don't refer to myself as being in recovery, because I find that this word recovery, what that is saying is that I was a sick person that was different than everybody else. I was somebody that was sicker than other people in the world, when really all of us are in recovery from something, every single person on this planet. And, you know, if someone wants to use the word recovery, that's great. For me, I don't consider myself someone who was sicker than everybody else. I chose a coping mechanism that happened to be illegal, and I got criminalized for it, which made me suffer things like going to jail and being homeless, and many of the other consequences that drug users deal with. And so I think that this is something that is really important to consider in terms of the Ibogaine treatment context, because when I started working in the Ibogaine community, I thought that harm reduction was going to be the main concept that was embraced. But I came to find out that many clinics are actually working from the disease model and abstinence only perspective, and we're reinforcing this notion that the only version of success is complete abstinence. The reason that this is really dangerous for people is because often Ibogaine is marketed as this thing like a cure or a solution, which is language we shouldn't use, because it sets people's expectations super high. And when they don't have this miraculous experience where their cravings are gone forever and they never use again, they feel like they're a failure. And if Ibogaine didn't work for them, nothing is going to work. And any kind of work they've done on themselves doesn't matter because they used again. And this is the same kind of concepts from abstinence only, is if you use again, any work you did goes out the window. Which in fact, no one can ever take away the work that you've done, whether you use again or not. In fact, you can do work on yourself when you're using, just like Andrew was said, and that will never go away there. I have a number of Ibogaine clients that I work with after their treatments who do go back and use sometimes. But I find that after a period of time, they get to another point where they want to either do Ibogaine again or do some other kind of treatment. And then they do incredibly well. And they always go back and say that first Ibogaine treatment, even though I used afterward, made a huge difference for me. And so I think that this is really important to keep in mind, because I also often see people who, go out and use again and say, I'm a complete failure, nothing is going to work. They stay far away from their family because the family is angry and frustrated with them that they're using again. When really what could potentially happen in this situation is the person could be embraced and supported in exploring what's going on for them and why they're still using. And maybe if there's some things that can potentially be changed about the structure of their community and the kind of support they're getting. So it's really important to get away from this like black and white thinking of success and not success, of using and not using, and relapse and all of this, and just to say to people, what is it that is success for you? What's even, okay, so you're using again, but what did Ibogaine do for you? What kind of new realizations have you had? And really forming this kind of collaborative relationship with people, rather than already deciding that this is the only thing that's going to mean success for you without even consulting the person. And something that I also want to talk about is, our relationship to substances constantly evolves and changes. And as people do work on themselves with a therapist or some other kind of healing practitioner, a person won't reach for a substance in the same way. And so for me, what that has meant is that I can microdose psychedelics. I can also have a glass of wine and I don't end up in jail or in an institution like the 12-step program told me. And that might come as a surprise for a lot of people. And maybe for other people, not touching anything ever again is the right thing. But really, there are a lot of people who are able to do work on themselves and have certain substances again and in a healthy way. Because once you start addressing the reasons that you needed a coping mechanism, you won't reach for a substance with the same kind of desperation to escape that you once did. The reason I have a glass of wine isn't because I'm miserable in my life. I actually feel like really excited about life and I'm happy to be here. So I don't need to dissociate anymore like I once did. And so I think that this is really important to acknowledge, is that just because someone has a destructive relationship with substances at one point doesn't mean that it is always going to be that way for them. It's a constantly evolving process, and using a model that says once you're sick, you're always sick kind of holds people hostage. And it doesn't leave room for the possibilities of the infinite amount of paths that people can take going through this process. So, again, like, what does this have to do with Ibogaine treatment? I just want to reinforce that I think the harm reduction model and embracing a diversity of experiences is really crucial to pair with Ibogaine treatment, so that people can feel supported no matter what the outcome of their treatment. One of the big obstacles that I notice in working with people around Ibogaine treatment is family members, and is difficult family relationships that often people have to return to afterwards. Most people in this country are indoctrinated into the 12-step model and have a lot of fear around people's substance use, which is understandable because often families have seen their loved ones go through really scary, dangerous things, overdoses, they might end up in comas, they might end up going to prison for some time. So people are really scared around substances and they want to do everything they can to make sure nothing happens to this person. But this can also create a power imbalance in family members, and family members that want to control their loved one and push an agenda on the loved one. And this can be a really dangerous and re-wounding dynamic for people to come home to. And so it's really crucial for this reason for the family member to also be doing their own work and looking at how they might have contributed to the dynamic in the family that made their loved one want to escape in the first place. And also learning about harm reduction and what that actually means, and taking it from this concept of how we're describing it and actually seeing like, well, what does that mean? It's about being collaborative with people instead of saying you need to do this and this is the only way. It's about saying, asking questions. It's about listening. It's about being able to be self-reflective with yourself and acknowledge mistakes as well. And this is what creates a safe space in a family, so that if your loved one comes home from Ibogaine and they're struggling, if you've created a collaborative space, they're going to be more likely to come to you and say, hey, I'm struggling and I want to talk about it, rather than hiding it and isolating themselves away and putting themselves in a dangerous position where they could overdose and die. And so the harm reduction approach is not just for clinicians, it's also for families as well. And like I was saying, when I first started working in Ibogaine, I was really surprised by the one-size-fits-all narrative that's very prevalent in clinics and also in the psychedelic therapy space as well. And this is why I co-created a course at the Center for Optimal Living that we just did in the spring called Working with Psychedelics to Treat Substance Use Issues, which is really about bringing the harm reduction approach more to the forefront of psychedelic therapy. And that's available. The recordings are available online if anybody wants to access that. But harm reduction isn't just about substance use. It's about working collaboratively with everybody across society. In mental health as well. I really think the root of a lot of our mental health systems are from a culture of domination. It's from a culture, our culture, which was based in colonization and oppression and slavery. And so we've all been raised in this kind of hierarchical power imbalance society where we as children were told what to do and we weren't consulted and we weren't collaborated with. And so then we kind of perpetuate this very violent, dominating and oppressive tendency within even mental health, which is supposed to be about helping people. And so I really think that to truly support people struggling with drugs, we have to question power dynamics. We have to question how we interact with each other in our lives, how we treat each other and our families, how our work environment is structured. Really, the healthiest way is to be collaborative, where everybody's wisdom and experience is acknowledged and taken into account. And people aren't afraid to be wrong. That's the other thing, is I think there's a high rate of perfectionism among people struggling with drugs because we're terrified to be wrong because of punishment. And so really, when we're talking about harm reduction, we're talking about a total reconceptualization of the way that we structure society. So yeah, before we go to the Q&A, I would love, Andrew, if there is something that I mentioned that you want to ask a question about or comment on.
Well, you've raised so many valuable, important, really complex issues. Where do I begin? Where do we begin? I think everyone who's listening just has a lot to process. But yeah, harm reduction is about valuing and empowering, supporting. It's about leveling the playing field, the power playing field. It's about supporting people. I think about it as getting in the driver's seat of their lives, of their relationships to substances, to their behaviors. It is also, we one of the tenets is that we're all experts, and we want to invite everyone to the table to bring their expertise, regardless of your age or your training or your life experience. Let's invite people to own their expertise and come together as a community to collaborate and support each other in moving in a positive direction. That's really what harm reduction is about. And but to bring it, there are a couple of maybe specific things. Just want to make it clear to everyone that harm reductionists and anyone else who doesn't think they're a harm reductionist share the same ultimate goals. Anyone who is struggling with a substance is suffering. What we want to do is help reduce suffering to the greatest extent possible. if that's abstinence or that's non-problematic use. And I would bet that almost anyone, whether they identify as a harm reductionist or not, would agree with that. If you can use a substance in a non-problematic way and enhance the quality of your life, what's the problem? If you can't and you choose abstinence, that's your wonderful goal, right? So I think the sort of the therapeutic question is, how do we ideally help people get from where they're struggling to that ultimate ideal outcome? And the traditional approach of jump this high, do what I tell you to do, take the cotton out of your ears and stick it in your mouth. Actually, either it sets up what I call, and you alluded to this, a submit rebel bind. You submit to my authority, but then you have to disconnect from yourself. You can't do the work of really deeply connecting to yourself if you've got to submit to my authority to be in treatment with me. Or if you wind up feeling disempowered, angry, infantilized, ashamed, humiliated, you may have to rebel to have a sense of empowerment and agency by using a drug. But if you're in submit rebel, you're not actually having a space to discover what's your proper, ideal, healthiest relationship to drugs, right? So the harm reduction stance wants to avoid putting people in that position and create a space to empower people and support people to discover what's true for them. That's one thing. One other important thing is about doing whatever treatment you're in, Ibogaine, and going back to using. Relapse, as you put it, suggests disease. But if we shift to that lens of meaning, if I pick up a drug or a drink, and I have a space to support me in being curious about what is the meaning of that choice, then it may be that something's getting expressed that I'm not so clear about, that maybe through the exploration of that use, that decision to use, I may actually be able to discover something about myself, right? And deepen my process actually through the use of that drug, and having a space then to think about it. So, change doesn't happen in a straight line. We try out one option and we'll see how that is. And then maybe we try another one. And that's part of the process of self-discovery and growth, right? To discover what's best for me. So yeah, you're right on about, we don't want to set people up in treatments of any kind to feel like they need to go out and be perfect. We want to kind of set people up with skills that they can take out for seeing the ongoing process of self-discovery and growth as moving toward that ultimate discovery and implementation of what's my ideal use plan or relationship to substances. So do we have questions, comments from the gang out there? I'm really curious who's joined us.
We had one question about the use of Ibogaine and if it's okay to, this person here asked if it's okay to use it more than once. It helped her with addictive patterns, but maybe didn't end the addiction, it sounds like, and how often one can use it, I guess.
Yeah, hi, Gyne. So it's really unique to each person, how to use Ibogaine, how frequently, if there's multiple treatments, if there's microdosing, there's like no one right way. I mean, obviously there's no need to do tons of flood dosing, but I think that there are people who do it a second time a year later or 2 years later. Microdosing, I feel like, is often overlooked as a wonderful and very safe option. And it still requires care, microdosing, because it can interact with certain medications and drugs. So it's something that you still want to do under the supervision of somebody, but it's a really powerful way to keep the like the neurogenerativity going. You know, I have found in my own process that if I'm feeling like I'm really blocked in some area and really stuck somewhere emotionally, that doing a very small microdose of Iboga could totally help me have a breakthrough and work through whatever that issue is. So I think bigger isn't always better. Microdosing can be a wonderful way to keep going, and it just really depends on your unique situation, and highly advise consulting someone about it though, and figuring out a way that works for you and to do it safely. Mm. Does anyone else want to pop a question in the chat or in the Q&A section? Oh, there's Clifford. Clifford was also an attendee at our training, so it's really nice to see you here. Is there hope that Ibogaine legal status will change in the foreseeable future? Yeah, I think there's hope. There has been some states and city-led initiatives in the US that have decriminalized psychedelics. This doesn't necessarily mean you can open a medical treatment center giving a treatment like Ibogaine. Although I'm sure people are going to try. I'm not sure if people will be legally protected in doing this. But I do think that we are moving in the direction of Ibogaine becoming available in the US. It becoming federally available might take a while just because clinical trials take a long time. So I think really the best and safest option for people in the US right now is to go to a recommended place in Mexico or Costa Rica.
There was another question, I think, Juliana.
Yes.
A few more.
Yeah.
Bulimia. Has Ibogaine been helpful for clients with bulimia?
Yeah, I have seen it.
Eating issues, yeah.
I have seen it be helpful with various eating issues. I've found that people with eating disorders really need to have long-term ongoing treatment with a therapist after Ibogaine, just because you know, eating issues can be harder than substance use issues sometimes because you can't not eat, you have to keep eating. And so whereas I can stay away from opioids and not have to deal with that trigger, eating is the trickier one. And so I think the more support, the better, but that Ibogaine could be one of the tools of many to be used in conjunction together. Yeah.
I wanted to make a comment about drinking after you've had a significant substance use issue or addiction, if that's the way you define it. I think that the data about what happens with people who have had significant substance use issues down the line actually challenges the disease concept, because, and this is something Stanton Peele is really one of the most important spokespeople for, that the majority of people who have had significant substance use issues actually, quote, recover or develop either abstinent or non-problematic relationships to substances without treatment of any kind. That's, for us treatment people, we need to really look at, you know, our relative value in the world. That actually,
yeah, not everybody needs treatment.
Most people don't need us, right? But many of us harm reduction treatment people, like at the Center for Optimal Living, we see that many people with really severe problematic relationships to substances can and do kind of effectively establish very moderate, very safe relationships to substances. And some people, in the course of attempting to do that for a variety of reasons, really decide that abstinence is the safest, healthiest, or even easiest choice for them. So, you know, this is not about predetermining, you know, what goal makes the most sense for you. We want to support people in discovering that for themselves. So it's really a self-affirming choice that that people are making in relation to substances.
Yes, and I'm really glad that you said that, because I just want to point out that the place I've gotten to in my substance use was really a lot of trial and error. And it started off with 2.5 years of absolutely nothing, not even a microdose of Iboga.
Mm.
And that was for me really important to, reset my relationship to substance use. And after that, I was very careful and slow about how I introduced microdosing with psychedelics. And having a glass of wine didn't happen until 7 years in. And also, I never had an issue with alcohol. There's a lot of clients who really struggle with alcohol, and it might never be a thing they can add in. So I think it's just something that just because it's working for me doesn't mean it's for everybody. And it's really a unique thing. And something else that I also see happening in the psychedelic kind of recovery space is that people feel obligated to like do more ayahuasca ceremonies, or, oh, I haven't tried 5-MeO-DMT. And I've faced a lot of pressure to do more psychedelics, which does not serve me anymore. And like, I'm really happy with my microdosing, and have found that large doses of psychedelics overtax my nervous system. And so I think this is really important to consider, is that everybody's got a really unique thing, and we need to be really careful about pushing any kind of substance use agenda, even if we think it's healing, onto a person when they're, working on these types of issues.
Yeah. Hey, Tom, I think you had a question about the future of harm reduction treatment.
Yes, I did. It's so great to see you both. I've been listening in the background, but so impressed with both of your insights and your presentation, Andrew. It's great to be here. It's great to see you both. And as I mentioned in the chat, Talia's internet went out right at the last couple of minutes. So she's trying to log back in, but we're also out of time. I wanted to join and say hello and thank you.
Hi.
But yes, I'm interested in, where does this go? What's the next therapeutic model innovation that you're hoping for?
Yeah, after many, 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 many years that many of us have been, working in the trenches to kind of get these, what we think of really are really important, valuable ideas and practices out. We're in the middle of a sea change. I think in the last 2, 3, 4 years, and maybe it's unfortunately a reaction to 100,000 people a year dying of overdose. It takes death and destruction and catastrophe to shake people out of, they're being wedded to old ideas that don't work. I think the psychedelic research and the research and data on Ibogaine and cannabis, are also having an impact in the sea change that, are making everybody think, well, we have a lot to rethink about our relationships to substances and how we can most effectively help. But what's happening is just in many ways amazingly hopeful. The New York State Office of Addiction Services and Support, OASAS, which has been, that's the agency that oversees all addiction treatment in New York State, has traditionally been very abstinence only. And they, in the last few years, have made a total radical commitment to pushing harm reduction principles throughout the entire treatment system. And they actually just did a 4 webinar series on harm reduction for the New York State system. They invited me to give the model, the harm reduction treatment model. And these 4 webinars are actually available for free in recording. If anyone wants them, I can make them available to you, Tom, to share with your community. People can reach out to me at the Center for Optimal Living, and I can make those available to people. So that's one indication that, that what we have been working toward, which is to make harm reduction the state-of-the-art approach to treatment, is now being embraced by New York State. We have friends at the federal level and many of the federal agencies involved with drugs and addiction that are fully embracing harm reduction, SAMHSA, ONDCP, CDC, and others. We have been approached by different state governments who want us to train them, Maryland, Florida, others. So, this work is getting out. And one other comment I want to make, I wrote a paper in 2003 called Harm Reduction Therapy, Extending the Reach of Traditional Treatment, because I want to say that there are a lot of good traditional treatments out there that actually help a lot of people. Harm reduction is not at odds with those treatments. I really think of, abstinence-based treatment, residential, detox, intensive outpatient, for many people are life-saving, just as AA is for many people. What this model does is it extends, it opens the door to this huge group of people have traditionally been kept out. And that's the good news, in all of this, kind of really bridging the whole continuum of care, including medications and medicines like Ibogaine, for those people who really need a brain to be readjusted, need miracle growth of the brain, as Bruno said.
Yeah, that's a great metaphor. I wonder, one other question, if you don't mind me taking advantage of having you here, is do you find, or do you have an opinion, and this is for both of you, Juliana and Andrew, do you find that there are many more therapists themselves becoming more willing to embrace some of or all of the principles of harm reduction as an approach, just like they are with psychedelics with Ibogaine? We find that more and more therapists are coming to us and saying, hey, we want to collaborate with a partner. We ourselves want to learn about Ibogaine assisted therapy for addiction treatment. Is that also happening in the sliver of this solution set that you spend most of your time looking at?
I think that it's getting better, and it just kind of depends where you are. I mean, there's a lot of rigidity in mainstream treatment around abstinence only in the disease concepts. I find that addiction specialists who've worked in the field for a long time are the most difficult ones, who aren't interested in learning about these things. But then we have like a new generation of therapists who are seeing the high numbers of overdoses that we have and seeing that our traditional treatments aren't working that well, who are more open to these options. So I think that people are becoming more and more interested in psychedelic therapy, including Ibogaine, and also in harm reduction. As Andrew was just illustrating, I mean, if New York State is excited about harm reduction, it's a huge step.
Yeah. We do a 3-day intensive training at the Center for Optimal Living. We call IHRP, Integrative Harm Reduction Psychotherapy Essentials. We've been doing it for 11 years. When we first started, we had a hard time filling it once a year. Now we're filling it twice a year through the center. We have a 15-week certificate program we're filling every year. We're getting invited to train people around the country. Now, interestingly, more often it's mental health centers, mental health organizations that are recognizing that traditionally they've sent their substance using people out to addiction treatment, and those folks got worse. And so they're realizing that they need to learn how to address the substance use in the context of their mental health care. And that's exactly what integrative harm reduction therapy does. But it's kind of rolling across the country. I mean, people are realizing we have to know how to do this stuff. So it's an exciting time where I think about this essentially as being about love, compassion, radical acceptance, empathy, support, empowerment, collaboration. These are all the values that I think are at the heart of harm reduction approaches, helping people find the path that best suits them.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with that. Sorry, Juliana.
No, I was just going to say, and listening to people, listening to the people who are struggling with drugs, consulting the people who are struggling with drugs. On the training that we did at the Center for Optimal Living, we had a panel of people who actively use substances, led by Dr. Carl Hart, sharing their voices and perspectives. And I think this is really important because there's been so much damage and dehumanization perpetuated towards people struggling with substances, and they need to be included in the conversation as to what works for them, rather than treated as kind of like this separate entity that doesn't know what's best for themselves. And so I think that this is really the future, is to be collaboratively creating treatments and protocols and policies. I also, before we end, Susan Bowling asked a really important question about resources for aftercare after Ibogaine treatment. This is something that is really needed in the Ibogaine community, because often people just have to go back home to really unhealthy living environments, and it's not ideal. There is an amazing facility that I've visited personally called Inscape, which is in central Mexico. Their website is Inscape Recovery. That's really the best option we have for post-Ibogaine treatment right now. There's other people who are working on creating some aftercare centers, but it's still in development. So I'm really hopeful that there's going to be more of Ibogaine focus, post-Ibogaine focused centers in the near future.
Yeah, we have a really great, I think, emerging, but still very strongly based in principle relationship with Inscape. Have a lot of respect for the work that they do there, the team that they have there. We've had numerous clients both go directly from Beyond, where they spend 7 to 10 to 14 days here, and then go to Inscape and spend time there as well, and had phenomenal results. And we've had people go back to their local community and engage in treatment or intensive outpatient treatment. One of the things that we are developing is our own alumni program, because we find that the people who have gone through an Ibogaine treatment, through insight-oriented Ibogaine, looking for those insights that help them heal, are some of the best people to advise the people that are considering it, to tell them what it was like, how it has helped, where the realities of the struggle have been, where the surprises are, surprising developments and achievements. And our own alumni program is growing rapidly, and we're very proud of that. Welcome back, Taya.
Tom, I mentioned earlier that, I was introduced to Ibogaine by Howard Lotsoff, and then met loads of folks over the years who had this medicine and whose lives were saved and transformed. But in 2016, I also want to mention that Juliana invited me to present and participate in the Gita conference in Tepoztlan, Mexico, the Global Ibogaine Treatment Alliance. Is that our therapy?
Yes, you got it. Therapy.
And so I had the experience, I had an immersion experience, like a flood dose of the Ibogaine community, and fell in love with this community, because it's a community that by and large, not all, but kind of embraces a lot of the principles that we've been talking about. And it's, courageous people that are sort of doing something really cutting edge and really important to saving lives. It made me think that Ibogaine is truly a psycho-biosocial, spiritual experience, because of that community aspect also, which has, I think, always been very important to people that are, getting helped by Ibogaine. I know that there are communities in Mexico that have come together around their Ibogaine experiences for mutual support. So I think what you folks are doing is wonderful, and creating this alumni group will be so important to people's continued growth and healing.
You're absolutely right. And it is somewhat magical and mystical that when people become open to the possibility of experiencing Ibogaine assisted therapy for addiction and trauma, they seem to report that the medicine is calling them. They seem to already begin to experience opportunities for observing transformation. Relationships seem to shift in one way or another. People who have had some experience or curiosity about Ibogaine seem to emerge simply by being willing to consider it. And maybe I'm making more of that than there is, but it seems to be a increasingly common representation by our prospective guests, and our alumni. It's pretty remarkable.
Mhm.
Well, what a wonderful way to wrap up. We started this series in March, and every guest has, come with all of their domain expertise. They've worked so hard to put this together, presentations, and you guys did nothing less and just absolutely brought incredibly new insights and awareness. And we can't thank you enough for being a part of Beyond, a part of Ibogaine Insights, and helping us promote the work that we all do, harm reduction, Ibogaine assisted therapy, and the benefits that so many people are so deeply in need of. And in the coming weeks, we're going to be doing something quite different with Ibogaine Insights, and we're actually inviting some of our recent guests and even their families to join to talk about the experience of making the decision, of investigating, of doing research into Ibogaine. That's completely cold. Some people had never heard of it one day, and the next day they were, like many of us, Googling Ibogaine and having an experience of a broad range of valid and invalid information, to just give a sense of what it's like to go through that whole journey of preparation, pre-treatment, treatment, and aftercare. And really look forward to introducing some of those folks and their families to you. And we'd love, of course, to continue this work that we're doing together, both with you, Juliana, and you, Dr. Tatarsky.
Well,
Well,
thank you
thank-
so much for having us and for doing this
Pleasure.
series. It's been great to have this conversation, and happy to be supporting your work at Beyond too.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Yeah, I feel the same way. It's kind of an honor for me to be contributing to this work, to our communities, and to know that you folks are doing such wonderful, special work at Beyond.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And with that, I am going to shut off my video. We usually keep the conversation open. If people want to continue the dialogue, please feel free. But it's been such a pleasure to be a brief part of your outstanding presentation. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Talia, for hosting our event this evening. You did a phenomenal job. I want to acknowledge Dr. Jeffrey Camlett, our Chief Medical Officer, who was a participant this evening, and just an honor and a privilege to be able to do this together with you. So thank you all very much.